"Clear the trauma bay. Move it, Ravenshire. You're taking up oxygen." Dr. Iris Thorne's voice cracked like a whip over the cacophony of the Metro General ER. Outside, the Seattle rain hammered against the ambulance bay glass, a relentless grey static that matched the chaos inside. The double doors burst open, admitting a gust of freezing wind and a gurney surrounded by 4 men in dark suits who moved with the fluid, terrifying precision of apex predators. On the stretcher lay a man, massive, unconscious, and bleeding through layers of tactical gauze. Evelina Ravenshire stepped back into the shadows of the supply rack, her face a mask of practiced neutrality, though her eyes were already scanning the monitors before the leads were fully attached. She saw the erratic rhythm on the EKG 3 seconds before the alarms shrieked. She saw the tension, pneumothorax building in the patient's chest, while Thorne was still shouting at the residents to cut the clothes. She reached for a 14-gauge needle and a chest tube tray, placing them silently on the sterile field, just as Thorne realized he needed them. He snatched them without looking at her, without a thank you, treating her as nothing more than a piece of furniture that occasionally dispensed miracles. "He's crashing!" a nurse screamed. Evelina didn't scream. She watched the patient's hand, calloused, scarred, and trembling with a violent, subconscious fight, drop from the rail. She knew, with a heavy, sinking certainty, that before the night was over, the hierarchy of this room would shatter, and the only thing tethering this warrior to the earth would be the grip he refused to release. Chapter 1. The Ghost in the Machine. The patient was registered as John Doe Alpha, but the hospital staff, prone to gossip even in the face of death, had already dubbed him the Titan. He took up the entirety of Bed 1 in the ICU, his frame spanning nearly the full length of the mattress. Under the harsh fluorescent lights, the map of his life was visible on his skin. Shrapnel scars that had healed into white starbursts, burn marks fading on his deltoids, and a tattoo of a trident half obscured by fresh bandaging on his shoulder. Evelina Ravenshire stood at the nurse's station, her posture perfect, her presence negligible. She was 26, with pale features and hair pulled back so severely it pulled at her temples, earning her the nickname the Librarian from the surgical residents. To them, she was the rookie, the transfer from a rural clinic who never spoke during rounds, never laughed at their dark humor, and never complained about double shifts. They mistook her silence for vacuity and her stillness for fear. They were wrong. "Ravenshire, check the drain output on Bed 1. The charge nurse, Brenda, barked without looking up from her crossword puzzle. "And don't disturb the suits. They're already threatening to shut down the wing if we look at them wrong." Evelina nodded, slipping her silver fob watch, an antique piece that pinned to her scrub top, into her pocket to mute its ticking. She moved down the hallway, her rubber-soled shoes making no sound. Inside the glass-walled room of Bed 1, the atmosphere was pressurized. 2 federal agents stood by the door, arms crossed, eyes behind sunglasses despite the dim lighting. They tracked Evelina as she entered. But she didn't flinch. Her focus was solely on Reginald Stormcliffe. That was the name she had seen on the encrypted transfer drive before Thorne had snatched it away. Reginald Stormcliffe, Master Chief, heavy combat specialist. She moved to the bedside. His breathing was ragged, fighting the ventilator. Evelina's eyes narrowed. The ventilator settings were standard protocol, volume control, 12 breaths a minute. But Stormcliffe's diaphragm was spasming, fighting the forced air. He was air stacking. The residents had set the machine for a sedated civilian, not a metabolically accelerated soldier burning through sedation like it was water. She glanced at the agents. They were watching the hallway. With a fluid, practiced motion, Evelina reached past the monitor. She didn't change the orders. That would be grounds for termination. But she adjusted the flow trigger sensitivity and slightly increased the expiration time, syncing the machine to his erratic struggle rather than forcing him to submit to the machine. Almost instantly, the thrashing beneath the sheet stopped. Stormcliff's heart rate dropped from a chaotic 130 to a steady 95. His hand, which had been clenched into a white-knuckled fist against the rail, relaxed. "Nurse," one of the agents said, his voice a low rumble. Evelina froze, keeping her eyes on the drain output she was supposedly checking. "Yes? What did you do?" "I adjusted the tubing," she lied smoothly, her voice soft, barely a whisper. It was kinked. He was uncomfortable. The agent stared at her for a long moment, looking for the lie. Evelina held his gaze, her expression placid, boring, unthreatening. He lost interest, dismissing her as exactly what she appeared to be. A rookie nurse changing a bag. "Right," the agent grunted. "Keep it that way." Evelina finished her rounds, her fingers brushing against the cold metal rail of the bed. For a fraction of a second, she felt a heat radiating from the man, a sheer vital force that terrified her. He wasn't just sick. He was a coiled spring held down by chemistry. As she turned to leave, she noticed the chart hanging at the foot of the bed. Dr. Thorne had prescribed a high-dose antipsychotic for agitation to be administered if he woke up. Evelina felt a cold prickle at the base of her neck. Given Stormcliff's current heart rhythm and the trauma load, that specific drug could trigger a torsades de pointes, a fatal arrhythmia. It was a textbook error for a doctor arrogant enough to treat a seal like a geriatric psych patient. She opened her mouth to speak to the residents clustered in the hallway, laughing about weekend plans, but the words died in her throat. She knew how that conversation went. She had tried it 3 times in her 6 months here. Each time, she had been written up for insubordination and questioning attending judgment. Silence is safety, she told herself, gripping the silver watch in her pocket. Keep him stable. Don't make waves. But as she looked back at Reginald Stormcliff, sleeping peacefully for the first time in hours, she knew the waves were coming regardless. The crisis began at 200 hours, triggered not by the patient, but by a shift change. Dr. Aris Thorne swept into the ICU like a monarch returning to his court, smelling of espresso and expensive cologne. He was the chief resident, a man whose ambition was only exceeded by his insecurity. He stopped at the nurse's station, slamming a file down. "Who touched the vent settings on bed 1? Thorne demanded, his voice ringing through the quiet unit. The chatter stopped. Brenda looked up, startled. "No one, doctor. The respiratory therapist hasn't been up since midnight." "Someone changed the trigger sensitivity," Thorne snapped, his face flushing. "It's not on protocol. I set that protocol explicitly." Evelina was in the medication room, drawing up saline. She heard the accusation and closed her eyes. It was a minute adjustment, one that had undoubtedly saved the patient from barotrauma, but to Thorne, it was an insult to his authority. She stepped out, wiping her hands. "I did, doctor." Thorne spun around, his eyes narrowing as he landed on her. "Ravenshire. Of course, the rural transfer who thinks she's House MD. "He was bucking the vent, doctor," Evelina said, her voice steady but low, trying not to make a scene. "He was air stacking. I just synced the trigger to his effort. His stats improved immediately." "You are a nurse, Ravenshire." Thorne stepped closer, invading her personal space, using his height to intimidate. "You do not diagnose. You do not adjust life support without an order. You wipe brows and you push meds. Do you understand?" "I understand the protocol, but the patient is a highly volatile federal asset, and you are compromising his care with your cowboy antics," Thorne shouted. The agents by the door straightened up, watching the altercation. Thorne, sensing an audience, pitched his voice louder. "You are reckless. You are incompetent. And you are lucky I don't fire you on the spot." "Doctor." "Thorne." Evelina tried one last time, desperation creeping into her tone. "Please look at his chart. The haloperidol you ordered PRN. With his QT interval, it's dangerous. If he wakes up and you push that—" "Enough!" Thorne slammed his hand on the desk. The sound was like a gunshot. "You are questioning my pharmacology now? Who are you? A community college grad with 6 months of experience. I am the chief resident." He turned to Brenda. "Get her off this patient. I don't want her near him. Put her on sit duty. She can sit in the corner and stare at the wall where she can't kill anyone." "But doctor," Brenda started, "we're short-staffed." "I said sit duty," Thorne roared. "Put her in bed 1's room, in the chair by the door. She is to observe only. If she touches a dial, if she touches the patient, have security escort her out of the building." The humiliation was absolute. The entire unit, nurses, orderlies, other doctors, was staring. Evelina felt the heat rise in her cheeks, a burning shame that threatened to water her eyes, but she clamped down on it with iron discipline. She nodded once, stiffly. "Understood, Doctor." "Good," Thorne sneered, straightening his white coat. "Now get out of my sight." Evelina walked to room 1. She passed the agents, who looked at her with a mix of pity and suspicion. She entered the room, pulled a plastic chair to the farthest corner, away from the bed, and sat down. For 3 hours she sat in the dark, hands folded in her lap, listening to the rhythmic beep of the monitor and the heavy mechanical breathing of Reginald Stormcliffe. She was the ghost again. Invisible. Useless. But she kept her eyes on the monitor. She watched the QT interval on the telemetry readout. It was lengthening. Subtle, but there. The stress of the trauma was affecting his heart conduction. Thorne entered periodically, checking his phone more than the patient, ignoring Evelina completely. At 4:30, Stormcliffe groaned. It was a deep, tectonic sound, rising from the bottom of his chest. His eyes scrunched tight, teeth grinding against the intubation tube. "He's waking up," Thorne said, looking annoyed. "Nurse, push the haloperidol. 5 milligrams IV push." He was speaking to the new nurse, a terrified intern named Sarah. Evelina stood up. "Doctor, please check the EKG. His QT is over 500. If you push that—" "Sit down, Ravenshire." Thorne didn't even look at her. "Sarah, give the drug." Sarah hesitated, looking from the angry doctor to the pale woman in the corner. Fear won out. She injected the drug into the IV port. Evelina sat back down, her heart hammering against her ribs. She gripped her silver watch so hard the metal bit into her palm. She watched the fluid travel down the line, entering Reginald Stormcliffe's vein. 1, 2, 3. On the monitor, the green line spiked. Then it dipped. Then it twisted into the chaotic, scribbled signature of a heart forgetting how to beat. The alarm didn't beep. It screamed. A solid, continuous red tone that signaled cardiac arrest. "Code blue! Code blue! Bed 1!" Sarah shrieked, dropping the syringe. Reginald Stormcliffe's body arched off the bed, a seizure gripping his massive frame as his heart fluttered uselessly. Thorne froze. For a pivotal second, the arrogance vanished, replaced by the sheer, paralyzing terror of a man who knows he has just killed a VIP. "Bag him!" Thorne yelled, his voice rising an octave. "Charge the paddles! Everyone out of the way!" The crash cart team swarmed in. The room became a kaleidoscope of panic. The agents drew their weapons, confused by the medical violence, shouting into their radios. "Get back!" Thorne yelled at the agents. "Clear the room!" Evelina stood in her corner. She saw the rhythm. Torsade de Puentes. It was a twisting of the points. Shocking it might work, but he needed magnesium, and he needed the tube out because he was biting it, gagging, creating a vagal response that was worsening the arrhythmia. They shocked him. Thump. Stormcliff's body slammed back onto the mattress. The monitor flatlined for a second, then picked up a rhythm. But it wasn't a normal sinus rhythm. It was tachycardia, fast, angry. And then Reginald Stormcliffe opened his eyes. They weren't the groggy eyes of a patient waking from surgery. They were wide, dilated, and devoid of humanity. They were the eyes of a man who had woken up in hell. He ripped the intubation tube out of his throat with a wet, tearing sound that made Sarah gag. Blood sprayed from his mouth. He roared, a sound so primal it vibrated the glass walls. "Restrain him!" Thorne shouted. "He's psychotic!" Two male orderlies and one of the agents lunged for him. Stormcliffe moved with a speed that defied physiology. He caught the agent's wrist, snapped it with a sickening crack, and tossed the man into the equipment rack. The monitors crashed to the floor, sparks showering the room. The lights flickered and died, leaving only the red emergency strobes pulsing like a heartbeat. "Lockdown! Seal the unit!" Someone screamed over the PA system. Chaos erupted. The medical staff fled. Thorne was the first out the door, scrambling backward, his face white. "Seal the doors! Don't let him out!" The glass sliding doors to room 1 hissed shut and magnetically locked, sealing the biocontainment unit. Inside the room, the silence was sudden and heavy, broken only by the strobe light and the labored, ragged breathing of the beast in the center of the room. Reginald Stormcliffe stood by the bed, ripping IV lines out of his arms, blood streaming down his chest. He was hallucinating, swinging his head wildly, looking for the enemy in the shadows. He grabbed a pair of trauma shears from the fallen crash cart and held them in a reverse grip, crouching low. Outside the glass, the hallway was empty. The staff huddled behind the nurse's station. Thorne was shouting into a phone, calling for SWAT. Evelina was still in the room. She hadn't moved. She sat in her plastic chair in the corner, shrouded in the shadows. The magnetic lock had sealed her in with him. Stormcliffe spun around, his eyes locking onto her. He didn't see a nurse. In his delirium, amidst the flashing red lights and the smoke from the fried monitor, he saw an insurgent. A target. He took a step toward her, the glass of broken ampules crunching under his bare feet. He raised the shears, his chest heaving, his muscles coiled to strike. Evelina didn't scream. She didn't beg. She didn't run to the glass and pound on it like the others expected her to. She stood up slowly, her hands open, palms visible. She stepped out of the shadow of the corner and into the pulsing red light. She wasn't looking at the weapon. She was looking at his eyes. She saw the terror behind the rage. She saw the soldier who was lost in the dark, waiting for a command that made sense. "Chief," she said. Her voice was not the whisper she used with Thorne. It was a command tone, low, resonant, and absolutely steady. It cut through the noise of the alarms. Stormcliffe hesitated. The title pierced the fog. He blinked, sweat dripping into his eyes, mixing with the blood on his face. He snarled, taking another step, the shears inches from her throat. "Chief Stormcliffe," Evelina said again, not retreating an inch. She didn't raise her hands in surrender. She held them out as if offering something. "Stand down." Outside the glass, Dr. Thorne watched with his hands pressed to his mouth. "She's dead," he whispered. "He's going to butcher her." Stormcliffe trembled. The muscle memory of violence was warring with the deep, instinctual need for a medic. He looked at the small woman in front of him. She wasn't fighting. She wasn't fleeing. She was the only thing in the spinning world that was standing still. He lunged, but he didn't strike. He collapsed forward, his legs giving out as the adrenaline crash hit him. He fell toward her, a wall of blood and muscle. Evelina didn't dodge. She caught him. She buckled under the weight, dropping to her knees. But she didn't let him hit the floor hard. She wrapped her arms around his torso, guiding him down, sliding with him until they were both on the linoleum amidst the wreckage. He was gasping, choking on blood and air, flailing blindly. His hand, the size of a dinner plate, shot out and grabbed her wrist, crushing it. It was a grip that could pulverize bone. Evelina didn't pull away. She leaned in, pressing her forehead against his sweaty, blood-streaked shoulder. She ignored the pain in her wrist. She ignored the SWAT team gathering outside the glass with rifles raised. "I've got you," she whispered into the silence of the kill box he thought he was in. "You're safe. Hold on." Reginald Stormcliffe, the Navy SEAL who could kill a man with a thumb strike, squeezed the rookie nurse's hand until her knuckles popped. And then, surrounded by the wreckage of the institution that had failed them both, he began to weep. The silence inside room 1 was a physical weight, heavier than the pressurized air of the biocontainment system. The only illumination came from the rhythmic, slashing red strobe of the emergency alarm, which painted Reginald Stormcliffe's blood-streaked torso in brief, violent exposures. He was pacing the small perimeter of the room, his bare feet making wet, slapping sounds on the linoleum, the trauma shears held in a reverse grip, tight against his forearm. He wasn't aimless. He was patrolling. Evelina Ravenshire remained on the floor where they had fallen, her back pressed against the metal casing of the supply cabinet. Her wrist throbbed with a dull, sickening heat where he had crushed it. But she didn't cradle it. She kept her hands visible, resting on her knees, palms up. She watched him with the clinical detachment of a scientist observing a supernova. To the terrifying silhouette pacing before her, the room wasn't a hospital. It was a hostile extraction point, and the people outside the glass were enemy combatants. Outside, the hallway had transformed into a tactical command post. Through the blood-smeared glass, Evelina could see Dr. Eris Thorne gesturing wildly to a man in a flak jacket, the SWAT lead. Thorne's face was distorted by the glass, but his mouth movements were unmistakable. He was shouting, pointing at the room, spinning a narrative of a psychotic break, a hostage situation, a monster off the leash. He was writing Stormcliffe's death warrant to cover his own malpractice. Evelina shifted her gaze back to Stormcliffe. He stopped at the door, pressing his ear to the glass, then flinched, shaking his head as if shaking off a swarm of bees. He muttered something, a string of numbers and words that sounded like gibberish to the untrained ear. Sierra, 4. Charlie, broken arrow, grid, locked. He wasn't psychotic, he was reporting. Evelina watched his left hand. Every time he turned, he guarded his left flank, his elbow tucked tight against his ribs. It wasn't just a combat stance, it was a splint. He was protecting the insertion site of the chest tube she had placed earlier, which he had ripped out. His breathing was shallow, hitching every third breath. The pneumothorax was returning, and the haloperidol was still wreaking havoc on his conduction system. The rage Thorne had diagnosed was actually hypoxia, and the terrifying sensation of his heart misfiring. He was fighting to stay conscious, and his training had translated that fight into combat maneuvers. She looked at the overturned crash cart. It was a mess of shattered vials and tangled tubing, but near the wheel, half hidden by a crumpled sterile drape, was a small cardboard box. Magnesium sulfate, the antidote to the arrhythmia Thorne had induced. She needed to get to it, but Stormcliffe was currently treating the space between them as a kill zone. "Chief," she said softly. He spun, the shears snapping up. The red light caught the whites of his eyes, wide, terrified, but focused. He looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time since the collapse. He didn't see an enemy. He saw a civilian asset. He moved toward her, not to attack, but to position himself between her and the door. He crouched down, his massive frame shuddering with the effort to stay upright. "Stay down," he rasped. His voice was like gravel grinding in a mixer. Perimeter compromised. Extraction delayed. He was protecting her. Evelina felt a lump form in her throat, a sudden surge of emotion that she ruthlessly suppressed. Thorne had called him a monster. The staff had called him the Titan, an object of fear. But stripped of his mind, pumped full of poison, and bleeding out, his fundamental instinct was not to kill, but to shield. She slowly reached into her pocket, her fingers brushing the cool silver of her antique fob watch. It was a grounding object, something real in a world of beepings and data. "I need to check your perimeter," she lied, using his language. She pointed to the crash cart. "Supplies. For the extraction?" Stormcliff followed her finger. He stared at the cart, his brow furrowed as his brain tried to process the request through the haze of the drug interaction. He looked back at the door, where the SWAT team was now affixing breaching charges to the magnetic locks. "Hurry!" he growled. Evelina moved. She didn't scramble. She flowed. She crawled to the cart, keeping low, her movements deliberate. She grabbed the box of magnesium. She found a 10 cubic centimeter syringe that was still in its wrapper. She found a blunt needle. She drew up the solution, her hands steady, despite the adrenaline flooding her system. She had 4 grams. It was a massive dose, but he was a massive man, and he was dying. As she turned back, a loud thud vibrated against the glass. The SWAT team was testing the seal. Stormcliff roared, a sound of pure defiance, and lunged at the door, slamming his open palm against the glass. The impact cracked the safety pane. Outside, Thorne scrambled back, terrified. "He's breaking out!" Thorne screamed, his voice muffled but audible. "Take the shot. Take the shot when you breach." Evelina scrambled to her feet. She couldn't administer this IV. He had ripped the lines out. She had to go intramuscular. It would hurt. It would be dangerous. She walked up behind the giant who was pounding on the glass, screaming defiance at the world that had sent him to die. She was 5'4". He was 6'5" of lethal panic. "Reginald," she said. He didn't hear her. He was lost in the noise of the enemy. She reached out and placed her hand, her uninjured hand, flat against the center of his back, right over the tattoo of the trident. She didn't push. She just held it there. A point of contact. "You held my hand," she whispered to his back, echoing the memory of his grip on the rail, the grip on her wrist. "Now let me help you." He froze. The human touch, warm and steady, cut through the tactical noise. He turned slowly, looking down at her. The shears hung loosely in his hand. He looked confused, like a child who had woken up in a strange room. "Nurse," he breathed, the word foreign on his tongue. "Sit," she ordered. And to the shock of the armed men watching through the scopes of their rifles outside, the Titan sank to his knees. The countdown had begun outside. Evelina could see the SWAT lead counting down on his fingers. 5, 4. She had seconds. Reginald Stormcliff was on his knees, his head hanging low, his breathing hitching in wet, agonizing gasps. Evelina moved with ruthless efficiency. She tore the fabric of his scrub pants at the thigh. "This will burn," she said. She drove the needle into his vastus lateralis muscle and pushed the plunger. Stormcliff grunted, his whole body tensing, but he didn't strike her. He gripped her shoulder with his free hand, squeezing hard enough to leave bruises, grounding himself in the pain. Evelina didn't flinch. She emptied the syringe and withdrew it, tossing it aside. "Breathe," she commanded. In through the nose, out through the mouth. Reset your rate. She placed her hands on either side of his face, forcing him to look at her. The red strobe light made her skin look stark white, her eyes dark pools of calm. She was the eye of the hurricane. Look at me, she said, her voice dropping to that command tone again, stripped of all the rookie hesitation Thorne had mocked. You are in a hospital. You are safe. That is not the enemy. That is fear. Do you hear me, Chief? It's just fear. The magnesium was hitting his system, relaxing the smooth muscles, calming the electrical storm in his heart. The wild, dilated look in his eyes began to recede, replaced by a muddy clarity. He blinked, tears of sheer physiological stress leaking from the corners of his eyes. They... coming, he mumbled, nodding toward the door. Let them come, Evelina said. I am the ranking officer on this deck. You are under my care. Do you understand? It was a lie, a magnificent, treasonous lie. She was a junior nurse on probation. But in this room, in this moment, she was the only authority that mattered. Stormcliffe nodded slowly. Aye, ma'am. The explosives on the door detonated. The sound was deafening, a concussive crump that blew the glass inward in a shower of safety pellets. Smoke filled the room. Go, go, go! Men in black armor poured through the breach, rifles raised, blinding tactical lights cutting through the smoke. Drop the weapon! On the ground! Now! Stormcliffe tensed, his instincts screaming at him to fight. He began to rise, the shears still in his hand. Evelina stepped in front of him. She put her small, scrub-clad body directly in the line of fire, shielding the massive seal from the SWAT team. She raised both hands, not in surrender, but in a stop motion. Hold your fire, she screamed. It wasn't a scream of panic. It was a projection of pure vocal power that she had learned years ago in a life she had tried to bury. Medical emergency! Stand down! Move, lady! The lead officer shouted, his laser sight dancing on her chest. He's armed. He is a patient. Evelina didn't move. She didn't blink. He is post-ictal and sedated. If you shoot him, you are shooting a decorated serviceman who was given the wrong medication. Check your targets. The specificity of her shout gave the SWAT leader pause. Given the wrong medication. That wasn't the rambling of a hostage. That was a liability statement. Ravenshire, move! Dr. Thorne's voice came from the hallway, shrill and desperate. He's got a weapon. He's going to kill her. Shoot him! He is holding trauma shears, Evelina yelled back, not looking at Thorne, keeping her eyes locked on the SWAT leader's visor. And he is standing down. Chief Stormcliffe, drop the shears. She didn't turn around. She trusted him. It was the most dangerous gamble of her life. Behind her, there was a metallic clatter as the shears hit the floor. Weapon secure, Evelina announced, her voice dropping to a flat, professional calm. Patient is compliant. We need a gurney, not a body bag. Now get those lights out of his eyes before you trigger another seizure. The room hung in a suspended silence. The SWAT team lowered their weapons slightly, looking from the small woman to the giant kneeling behind her, head bowed, hands open on his knees. Dr. Thorne pushed past the police line, his face purple with rage. He saw his narrative crumbling. He saw the monster sitting quietly. He saw the incompetent nurse commanding a SWAT team. Arrest her, Thorne spat, pointing a shaking finger at Evelina. She compromised the scene. She endangered the hospital. She aided a violent psychiatric patient. Get her out of here. Two agents moved forward, uncertainly. Thorne grabbed the arm of the nearest officer. I am the attending physician. I am giving you an order. Remove this woman. Evelina felt her knees begin to shake as the adrenaline faded. The reality of what she had done, the insubordination, the physical danger, crashed down on her. She reached into her pocket and gripped the watch again. She had saved him. That was enough. Let them fire her. "Officer!" Thorne yelled. "Cuff her!" "That won't be necessary," a new voice boomed from the hallway. It was a baritone that carried the weight of decades of command. The crowd of nurses and doctors in the corridor parted like water. Walking through the debris of the shattered door was a man in a dress-grey naval uniform, his chest heavy with ribbons. He was older, with steel-grey hair and a face carved from granite. He ignored the SWAT team. He ignored the guns. He walked straight past Dr. Thorne as if the doctor were a ghost. He stopped 3 feet from Evelina and the kneeling seal. He looked at the wreckage of the room, the blood on the floor, the overturned cart. Then his eyes landed on Evelina. He didn't look at her badge. He looked at her face. And for the first time in 6 months, someone in this building looked at her with recognition. The newcomer was Admiral Marcus Vance, commander of Naval Special Warfare Command. His presence sucked the oxygen out of the room. The SWAT team lowered their weapons completely. The federal agents in suits straightened their ties and looked at the floor. Thorne, however, was too deep in his own panic to recognize the shift in gravity. "Admiral," Thorne stammered, stepping forward, trying to regain control. "I am Dr. Thorne, the chief resident. We had a situation with your man. He became violent, uncontrollable. This nurse," he gestured dismissively at Evelina, "interfered with tactical protocol. She refused to leave the room when I ordered a lockdown. She risked everyone's safety." Admiral Vance turned his head slowly to look at Thorne. His expression was one of mild curiosity, as if observing a particularly noisy insect. "Interfered?" Vance asked. "Yes. She countermanded my orders. She adjusted life support without authorization earlier, and now she's clearly suffering from Stockholm Syndrome or shock. I want her removed and processed." Vance turned back to Evelina. She was standing at attention now, her posture shifting unconsciously from nurse to something rigid and military. She was covered in Stormcliff's blood. Her hair had come loose from its bun. She looked exhausted, small, and utterly broken. "Is this true?" Vance asked her softly. Evelina met his eyes. She didn't defend herself. She didn't explain the QT interval or the haloperidol. She simply nodded. "I secured the patient, sir." "You secured him," Vance repeated, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. He looked past her to Stormcliff, who was now sitting up, blinking, his breathing steady. The Admiral looked at the monitors that were still functioning. He saw the sinus rhythm. He saw the makeshift bandaging on the chest tube site. "Tell me, Doctor," Vance said, turning back to Thorne. "If she hadn't interfered, what was your plan for breaching this room with a patient suffering from torsades de pointe?" Thorne froze. The color drained from his face. How did you know?" "We monitor our assets' telemetry remotely, Doctor," Vance said, his voice turning into ice. "We saw the arrhythmia start exactly 3 minutes after the haloperidol was administered. A drug which is contraindicated for a patient with blast trauma and cardiac stress. We were screaming at your switchboard to stop you, but you were too busy shouting orders to hear the phone." The silence in the room was absolute. The staff in the hallway gasped. Thorne opened his mouth, but no sound came out. "This woman," Vance continued, pointing a gloved hand at Evelina, "didn't interfere. She prevented a negligent homicide." Vance stepped closer to Evelina. He looked at her name tag, then up at her eyes. He squinted slightly, a flicker of memory sparking in his gaze. "Ravenshire," he murmured. "Evelina, the agonizingly quiet one from Landstuhl? The one who pulled 3 Rangers out of that burning chopper in 19? Evelina looked down. "I was just a medic, sir. I retired." "You were the best trauma specialist in the European theatre," Vance corrected her, his voice ringing out for everyone to hear. You disappeared. We thought you dead or burned out. He looked around the room, at the sneering doctor, the dismissive charge nurse, the agents who had ignored her. You have a ghost working for you, Vance said to the room at large. A ghost who just did the job of this entire department with a broken crash cart and a box of magnesium. He turned back to Evelina. Slowly, deliberately, the Admiral brought his hand up. He saluted her. It wasn't a casual wave. It was a formal, slow salute, holding it until she acknowledged it. Evelina hesitated. Her hand twitched. She wasn't military anymore. She was a nurse who got yelled at for taking too long in the break room. But the reflex was there. She straightened her back, raised her bloodied hand, and returned the salute crisp and sharp. At ease, Ravenshire, Vance said, lowering his hand. Thank you, sir, she whispered. Vance walked past her to Reginald Stormcliffe. He knelt down, putting a hand on the SEAL's shoulder. Easy, Master Chief. Calculation is done. You're safe. Reginald looked up. His eyes were clear now. He looked at the Admiral, then he looked at Evelina. He raised his heavy, scarred hand and pointed at her. She, Reginald croaked, his voice raw. She stayed, when the lights went out. I know, son, Vance said. That's what she does. Thorne was backing away toward the door, realizing his career was dissolving in real time. I have to go check on other patients. You will stay right there, Doctor, Vance said without looking back. The medical board is on the line, and my legal team is parking their car. Evelina felt a wave of dizziness hit her. The adrenaline dump was finally taking its toll. She swayed. Stormcliffe moved faster than anyone expected. He reached out and caught her by the arm, gently this time. He steadied her, his grip massive and warm. Got you, he rumbled. Evelina looked down at him, at the warrior she had pulled back from the edge. She offered him a tired, faint smile. I don't need a weapon, Doctor, she murmured, looking at Thorne one last time, her voice carrying the weight of total victory. I have a patient. And for the first time that night, the silence in the room wasn't heavy. It was reverent. The sun rose over Seattle not with a golden glow, but with the cold, hard grey of a prosecutorial dawn. Inside Metro General, the atmosphere was brittle. The wreckage of Room 1 had been cordoned off with yellow tape, looking more like a crime scene than a place of healing, which, in truth, it was. Evelina Ravenshire sat in the break room, staring into a cup of lukewarm coffee. Her hands were trembling, a delayed reaction she knew well from her past life. The adrenaline had receded, leaving behind the hollow ache of exhaustion. She expected termination papers. She expected legal threats. Instead, the door opened, and the hospital administrator, Marcus Sterling, walked in. He was a man who viewed medicine through the lens of liability insurance, and he looked as though he had swallowed a lemon. Flanking him were two legal representatives, and surprisingly, Brenda, the charge nurse, who had ignored Evelina for months. Brenda looked pale, her eyes fixed on the floor. Ms. Ravenshire, Sterling began, his voice oiled with forced collegiality. We have been reviewing the incident report filed by Admiral Vance. Evelina didn't stand up. She slowly turned her silver fob watch over in her fingers. Is Dr. Thorne pressing charges? Dr. Thorne is no longer with this institution, Sterling said quickly. His privileges were suspended effective 500 hours. The Naval JAG Corps has taken an interest in his prescribing habits. We are cooperating fully. Evelina nodded slowly. It was the sterile language of damage control. They weren't firing Thorne because he almost killed a man. They were firing him because he almost killed the wrong man. We want to offer you a settlement, Sterling continued, sliding a folder across the cheap laminate table. And a promotion. Charge nurse of the ICU. A significant salary adjustment. All we ask is that you sign a non-disclosure agreement regarding the specific pharmacological errors made last night. Evelina looked at the folder. It represented vindication. It was the power reversal the institution thought she wanted. They thought she wanted to be them. She pushed the folder back. "I don't want to be charged, nurse," Evelina said quietly. Sterling blinked. "I'm sorry? The salary is triple your current. I don't want to manage schedules, Mr. Sterling. I don't want to sit in meetings about budget cuts." She stood up, her small frame casting a long shadow in the morning light. "I want to be at the bedside. That is where the work is. That is where the mistakes are caught." "Ms. Ravenshire, you are a highly overqualified asset," Sterling pressed, desperate to buy her silence with status. "We wasted you. We see that now. Let us make it right." "You can make it right," Evelina said, her voice sharpening, "by ensuring that no resident in this hospital is ever too arrogant to listen to a nurse again. Change the culture, Mr. Sterling. Not my title." She walked past him to the door. Brenda finally looked up, tears in her eyes. "Evelina, I didn't know. About your service. About Landstuhl." Evelina paused, her hand on the doorframe. She looked back at the woman who had mocked her silence. She could have humiliated Brenda right there. She could have used her new connection with Admiral Vance to have Brenda fired too. "You didn't ask," Evelina said simply. Nobody asked. She walked out into the hallway. The change was instantaneous. As she moved toward the elevators, conversation stopped. Surgical residents who had called her the librarian suddenly found their shoes fascinating. A group of interns parted like the Red Sea to let her pass. It wasn't respect. Not yet. It was fear. They had seen the Admiral salute her. They knew she had held back a SWAT team. She hated it. She hated the celebrity of violence. She wanted the invisibility of competence. She took the elevator up to the 8th floor, the VIP secure wing where Reginald Stormcliffe had been transferred. 2 military police officers stood guard. They saw her badge, snapped to attention, and opened the door without a word. Inside, the room was quiet, sun-drenched, and peaceful. Reginald Stormcliffe lay in the bed, wires and tubes properly organized this time. His eyes were closed, but his breathing was deep and rhythmic. Evelina approached the bed to check his vitals. As she reached for his wrist, his eyes opened. They were clear, blue, and intelligent. No longer the eyes of a cornered animal. "Report!" he rasped, a faint smile touching his cracked lips. "Sinus rhythm," Evelina replied automatically, checking the monitor. "BP 110/70. Oxygen saturation 98%. "You're boring, Chief. That's a good thing." "Thorne? Gone." Reginald nodded, a grim satisfaction settling on his face. He looked at her, really studying her in the daylight. He saw the fatigue in her eyes, the way she held her own wrist where he had bruised it. "You didn't take the deal," he said. It wasn't a question. Evelina paused. "How did you know?" "Because you're here," he said, gesturing to the IV bag she was adjusting. "Changing a bag. You're a grunt, Ravenshire, like me. The brass doesn't suit you." Evelina felt a tightness in her chest loosen. "No, it doesn't." "Good." Reginald closed his eyes again, his massive hand relaxing on the sheet. "Then I'm in good hands. Wake me at 1400 hours. "Aye, Chief." She sat down in the chair by the bedside, not the corner this time, but right beside him. She took out her chart and began to write, the scratching of her pen the only sound in the room. For the first time in 6 months, she didn't feel like a ghost. She felt like a sentry. 3 days later, the rain returned to Seattle, a gentle, rhythmic drumming against the reinforced glass of the VIP suite. The hospital was buzzing with rumors about the incident in Room 1. But up here, in the quiet sanctuary of the secure wing, time moved differently. Reginald Stormcliffe was recovering with the terrifying speed of a man whose physiology had been engineered for survival. He was sitting up, eating solid food, and reading a dossier Admiral Vance had left him. But he hadn't dismissed Evelina. In fact, he had requested her for every shift she was legally allowed to work. It was 3 o'clock hours, the graveyard shift, the time when the veil between life and death is thinnest, and people tend to tell the truth. Evelina was sitting in the recliner next to his bed, reading a paperback. The room was dim, lit only by the monitor and her reading light. "Why did you leave?" Reginald's voice broke the silence. He wasn't looking at her. He was staring at the ceiling. Evelina marked her page and set the book down. She knew the question was coming. "I didn't leave. I retired." "You ran," Reginald corrected gently. "I know the look. I see it in the mirror. You were the best in Europe. Vance said you could thread a catheter in a helicopter during a barrel roll. Then, poof, rural clinic. Then here, hiding." Evelina looked at her hands. "I lost a patient, a 19-year-old kid from Ohio. Shrapnel wound. I did everything right. By the book. Perfect execution. And he died anyway. I realized I was good at the mechanics, but I couldn't stop the entropy. I couldn't play God anymore. So you came here to be invisible," Reginald said, "to do the small things, wipe the brows, check the drains." "The small things matter," Evelina whispered fiercely. "The small things are the only things we can control. If I had checked the small things with that kid, maybe. And if you hadn't checked the small things with me," Reginald turned his head, locking eyes with her, "I'd be dead, or a murderer." He shifted, wincing slightly as his chest tube sight pulled. "You think you're hiding, Evelina. But you're not. You're just guarding a smaller perimeter." He reached out his hand, the left one, the one closest to her. It was open, palm up, a silent invitation. Evelina hesitated. Professional boundaries were the walls she had built to keep the chaos out. But those walls had been blown apart 3 nights ago with magnesium and defiance. She placed her hand in his. His skin was rough, calloused, warmer than the room. His fingers closed around hers, not with the crushing grip of the seizure, but with a gentle, encompassing weight. It was an anchor. "Rest," he said. "I've got the watch." It was the inverse of what she had told him in the trauma bay. "I've got you." Now he had her. Evelina felt her eyelids grow heavy. The exhaustion of the last few days, the emotional toll of the confrontation, finally demanded its due. She rested her head on the side of the mattress, her hand still in his. "Just for a minute," she murmured. She fell asleep. She dreamed of fire. But this time the fire didn't burn. It was a warm light, and she wasn't alone in the smoke. She woke to the sound of the morning shift change cart rattling down the hall. The light in the room had shifted to the pale blue of early morning. She jerked up, realizing she had been asleep for hours. Panic flared. She had missed a vitals check. Then she realized she was still holding his hand, or rather, he was holding hers. She looked up. Reginald was awake, watching her with a soft, amused expression that transformed his harsh features. He looked human, vulnerable. Evelina blinked, wiping sleep from her eyes, her professional mask slipping completely. A bubble of laughter, fueled by sleep deprivation and relief rose in her throat. She giggled. It was a soft, girlish sound that seemed to surprise the room itself. "I fell asleep," she whispered, horrified but smiling. "You snore," Reginald deadpanned. "I do not." "Like a chainsaw," he teased, his thumb brushing over her knuckles. But I didn't mind. He looked down at their joined hands. The morning light caught the silver of her fob watch on the table and the white gauze on his chest. "You held my hand," she said softly, the realization hitting her. He hadn't let go for 4 hours. He had kept her tethered while she drifted. Reginald squeezed her fingers one last time before slowly releasing them. "Fair trade, Ravenshire. You held my life." The door opened. The morning nurse bustled in, full of noise and energy. Evelina stood up, smoothing her scrubs, stepping back into her role. But the connection remained, a silent frequency, humming between the Navy SEAL and the rookie nurse that no one else in the room could hear. 1 year later, the thumbnail quote on the hospital's monthly newsletter read, "Competence is a quiet language." It was attributed to charge nurse Evelina Ravenshire. She had finally accepted the title, but on her own terms. The ICU at Metro General was different now. The hierarchy of fear had been dismantled, replaced by a culture of absolute, terrifying competence. Residents no longer shouted, they asked. And when a nurse spoke, the room stopped to listen. Evelina walked the floor, her silver fob watch ticking in her pocket. She was no longer the ghost. She was the bedrock. "Nurse Ravenshire?" A young intern approached her, looking nervous. "Bed 3. His pressure is drifting." The attending said to wait, but you don't like the look of him," Evelina finished. "No, ma'am. Trust your gut," Evelina said, handing him a chart. "Go back in there. Recheck his leads. If you're right, call me. I'll back you up." The intern smiled, his shoulders dropping 2 inches. "Thank you." He ran off. Evelina watched him go, a small smile playing on her lips. The elevator doors at the end of the hall opened. A man walked out. He wasn't in a hospital gown this time, nor a uniform. He wore jeans and a dark leather jacket, walking with a slight limp that only added to his imposing stride. Reginald Stormcliffe. He had retired from the Navy 6 months ago. He now ran a specialized consulting firm for veteran integration, helping men who came back broken find a way to fit into the world without shattering it. He stopped at the nurses' station. The new staff didn't know him as the Titan who had torn the room apart. They knew him as the guy who brought the good coffee on Tuesdays. "Chief," Evelina said, walking over to him. "Ravenshire," he nodded. He looked healthy. The darkness was gone from his eyes, replaced by a steady, calm purpose. "How's the perimeter?" "Secure," she said. "Quiet shift." "Quiet is good," he said. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. He placed it on the counter. "What is this?" Evelina asked. "An apology," Reginald said. "And a thank you. From the boys at the command. And from Mu." Evelina opened the box. Inside was a pin, a small, golden trident. But it wasn't military issue. It had been modified. In the center of the trident was a tiny enamel caduceus, the symbol of medicine. "They call it the Guardian pin," Reginald explained softly. "They made one. For you." Evelina touched the cold metal. It was a bridge between her 2 lives, the warrior she had been and the healer she was. "I can't wear this on my scrubs," she said, her voice thick. "It's not regulation." Reginald leaned in, his voice dropping to that low rumble that vibrated in her chest. "Since when do you care about regulation, Evelina?" She looked up at him. The memory of the red strobe lights, the shattered glass, and the hand in the darkness passed between them. "You're right," she smiled, pinning it to her collar next to her silver watch. "I make the regulations now." He offered her his arm. "Shift's over. I'm buying dinner, and I promise not to break any furniture." "You better not," she said, coming around the counter. "I'm off the clock. If you crash, you're on your own." "I won't crash," Reginald said, taking her hand, boldly, publicly, in the middle of the ICU. "I've got a hell of a spotter." They walked toward the elevators together, the giant warrior and the small nurse. The staff watched them go, not with gossip, but with a quiet understanding. They were the survivors, the ones who didn't need to shout to be heard. As the elevator doors closed, cutting off the view of the busy hospital, Evelina Ravenshire squeezed Reginald Stormcliffe's hand. He squeezed back, and in the silence, they were loud enough. The story of Evelina and Reginald is a testament to the power of the unseen. In a world that often rewards the loudest voice in the room, it was Evelina's stillness that halted the chaos. The title, "The Navy SEAL Awoke Beside the Rookie Nurse." She giggled softly and said, "You held my hand," serves not just as a description of a moment, but as the thematic spine of their relationship. It represents the transition from traumatic dependence to chosen intimacy. Institutions, whether hospitals or militaries, are machines built on hierarchy. They often crush the individual to serve the protocol. Dr. Thorne represented the failure of that system, arrogance masquerading as authority. Evelina represented its redemption, competence masquerading as subservience. The reversal of power wasn't about Evelina becoming a loud commander. It was about the true commander, Admiral Vance, and the true warrior, Reginald, recognizing that the highest rank in that room belonged to the person who refused to let go. Ultimately, the story argues that kindness shown to the quiet is not just charity, it is survival. The quiet ones are often the ones watching the gauges, holding the lines, and keeping the world from spinning off its axis. When the noise stops and the lights go out, they are the ones still standing.